Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Callie and her family went through different losses. Her daughter Adelaide, whom she cared for, lived a medically complex life and died as a young child. Callie and I talked about the complex and challenging topic of deciding to take your child off life support and when to do this. She shares how she dealt with her grief at the time COVID came around, which kept her locked in and separate from her surroundings and her support system. Hearing Joe Biden's words, "To heal we must remember," had a big impact on her grieving journey towards accepting her grief instead of fighting against it, and to allow herself to move forward by remembering. About this week's guest. Callie Cervantes is an award-winning writer, speaker and advocate best known for her blog Inchstones, where she shares the stress, love and joy that came from parenting her medically complex daughter Adelaide. Since Adelaide's passing, Callie has continued to write candidly about her arduous and at times contradictory grief journey. She has been published in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times and Cosmopolitan, as well as quoted in the New York Times, CNN, and People. She's the current board chair for the nonprofit Cure Epilepsy and hosts their bi-weekly podcast Seizing Life, where she interviews scientists, doctors, and individuals affected by epilepsy. Callie resides in Maplewood, New Jersey with her husband, Miguel Cervantes, currently starring in Hamilton on Broadway, 4 children, and their 2 dogs. This week's podcast gift is a chapter of Callie's upcoming new book, which is just being published. So go to the website nathaliehimmelrich.com and find the podcast gifts page. And as always, just put in the number of today's episode. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Welcome, Callie. It's so nice to have you on the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast.
Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I'm feeling pretty good today. I'm excited. I'm practicing allowing myself to be excited right now. This is very new to me. I've not allowed myself to look forward to anything in years. And so I'm working very hard to allow myself to enjoy anticipating something and looking forward to something and being excited about a process and a journey. Which is my book coming out on November 7th. And it's about my grief and my grief journey. But that's sort of, it's hard though. It's a process to allow to, because there's always that voice in the back of my head that is questioning me. But it is a conscious, active effort to allow myself to be excited.
So why don't we give the listener a bit of background information until we circle back to your story and your book that is coming out soon. Why don't we start, as we always do, with you telling the listener a little bit about your story of loss, grief and trauma and how it is that it has shown up in your life.
Yeah. I experienced some childhood grief, grandparents passing away, but the first time that I really felt the full impacts of grief and trauma was so my son was born, and then when he was 2, I got pregnant, and everything seemed to be going well. And then our 20-week anatomy ultrasound, we found out that he had a fatal genetic anomaly, and he was not going to develop lungs. His heart was too big, his chest cavity too small, and he was not going to survive birth. He would probably develop inside my body, because through the umbilical cord, he was getting oxygen, but he was not going to be able to get oxygen out once he was outside of my body. And we made the excruciating decision to terminate the pregnancy. And I was in shock for a few days and then fell into deep grief. Tried to push through it, though, because I had a lot of conflicting emotions that, I didn't deserve to grieve like this because I had never met him. And it was also a very solitary grief, because even though my husband had lost this baby, also he had never, I felt the baby move in my body and he never had. And so it was just this very isolating experience to grieve someone that no one else had felt or experienced or knew. I really kind of just pushed through it and didn't address a lot of it. And in my head, I was like, well, this is my tragic story of my life, and we will keep moving forward. And several months later, was pregnant again with our daughter, Adelaide. And normal pregnancy, made it through that 20-week anatomy ultrasound somehow. And everything looked good. Everything looked healthy. She was born. She came shooting out. I mean, I think her labor was under an hour, which was drastically different from my first son. And it was as if she knew that she had limited time and wanted to make the most of it from the get-go. I remember a nurse telling me when I was in the postpartum wing that she seemed a little floppy. And in my head, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. All newborn babies are floppy. They can't hold their head. I don't, it completely disregarded this woman who has spent her entire career with newborn babies. But I needed Adelaide to be healthy. I needed her to be okay. And I figured that she had to be, because our son, Elvis, who we had lost, hadn't been. So clearly Adelaide had to be. Like, what were the chances that something could happen twice? And it had been explained to me that Elvis's genetic condition was a lightning strike. It was just one gene copied incorrectly. It was not hereditary. There was nothing that could have been done. So we sort of progressed. Adelaide was not gaining weight. She had a lot of issues. By her 2-month pediatrician appointment, the pediatrician suggested that we see a neurologist. She wasn't hitting some of her milestones. I was starting to recognize that something wasn't quite right, but still clinging to denial. I have this idea of this mother in my head that is, wildly irrational. And, I didn't want to be jumping to conclusions. I wanted, to follow the science and not freak out before I needed to. It took a while to get in to see a pediatric neurologist. And by then, so she was now 3 months old, a little over 3 months. And she still wasn't holding her head. She still wasn't making these, meeting these milestones. And she was diagnosed with low muscle tone. And it was, I was like, okay, she's not going to be an athlete. That's fine. I wasn't either. Like, we can deal with this. We got her into therapies, and she seemed to be doing a little bit better. She had her first seizure when she was 7 months old. And we started her on a medication, and she actually seemed to be doing much better. And then at 9 months old, she was diagnosed with infantile spasms, which is a really devastating form of pediatric epilepsy. Children who are diagnosed with IS can go on to lead a typical life. More often than not, they did not they will not have had any pre-existing conditions. Adelaide had a lot of pre-existing conditions going into infantile spasms with the developmental delays and the low muscle tone. And we would never get control of her seizures for, I think the longest period was about 3 months that she would go without having a seizure. But more often it was daily seizures. Were pretty regular. They would change what they looked like. They weren't always the same as she grew, but they were a constant in our life. And then we just started adding other diagnoses: dysautonomia, mast cell activation syndrome, additional specialists. She was having trouble breathing. Her brain wasn't sending the right signals to her lungs to breathe. And so she would just stop breathing. I had her attached to a pulse ox 24 hours a day to make sure that I knew if her heart rate spiked, that I knew a seizure was coming. Completely separate would be her, all of a sudden her oxygen rate would become really low, and either I needed to suction her or I needed to be prepared for her to completely desat, alarms going off. I learned how to resuscitate her at home. Recounting these stories, this October, it'll have been 4 years since she passed away. And enough time, I guess, has gone by. That was our normal. It was not normal, but it was our normal, right?
Just listening to you, it sounded like, just before you said it, as if you had to acquire so many skills that meant caring for your daughter that weren't your, I assume, normal skills, like of a nurse or caretaker. Yeah. So you had to acquire all these things just on a daily basis.
I mean, I got my worst grade in high school in human physiology. This was not my wheelhouse by any stretch of the imagination, but you will do just about anything for your child.
Of course.
And so I learned and I studied research. I got involved with a nonprofit called Cure Epilepsy that is the largest non-governmental funder of epilepsy research in the world, hoping that, maybe through there I could find researchers or raise money or find help or get, more involved in this epilepsy community. Because even though she had all these diagnoses, it was the seizures that impacted us the most. And so this was the community. During her life, we actually never got an underlying diagnosis. We never found out we knew it was genetic, but we never found out what it was. We actually ended up donating her brain to science, and just within the last couple months, got what we think is the genetic diagnosis for what was causing all of this nearly, 3.5 years later. So Adelaide lived a very medically complex life. She was nonverbal, non-mobile, attached to oxygen for about the last year of her life. And then in December of 2018, it was flagged that they thought her brain was deteriorating, that her brain was shrinking. We thought it could have been because of a steroid that she was on. By March, we had repeated the MRI and it showed again that her brain was deteriorating. She was no longer on the steroids. And so now we had confirmation that whatever was ailing her was neurodegenerative. And at that point, the doctors let us know that there was nothing else that could be done. But no one could give us a prognosis because they didn't know what was causing this. And so again, I clung to denial and I was like, this is fine. We'll probably still have a few years left with her. We had a phenomenal home nurse at this point who was with us 40 hours a week and was my saving grace for my sanity. And she actually had to sit me down that summer in 2019. And I don't know how she had the confidence or the wherewithal, but she had to sit me down and be like, Kelly, this is Adelaide is not okay. Adelaide is suffering, and we need to start moving into comfort care, into hospice care. We need to start moving down this path. And I'm just so incredibly grateful to her for everything that she did during Adelaide's life to help care for her, but the bravery that it must have taken to have such a difficult conversation. And to be fair, she had broached this conversation with me 2 or 3 times before, and I had shut it down, so that she continued to advocate and fight for what was in Adelaide's best interests. So we entered hospice in September of 2019, started pulling some of her, we stopped all outpatient treatments. There was going to be no more surgeries. We signed the do not resuscitate. We kept her at home and focused on comfort care. And I still thought that we would have months with her, maybe even a year. She passed away on October 12th, 2019. We had 6 weeks. Once we made the choice to let her go, she was clearly ready to go.
So can I ask a question there? You mentioned comfort care and palliative care and hospice. So for those people who are not aware of the differences, can you maybe elaborate so that we understand palliative versus comfort care?
Absolutely. So palliative care, we had actually started palliative care earlier in the year, when we knew that it was neurodegenerative. And it's sort of a step down from hospice care, I would say. The palliative care offered some additional services for Adelaide. She got to do some music therapy and some massage therapy. They took a little bit of work off of my plate in helping to manage some medications and things, and just sort of recognizing the difficulty in managing such a medically complex child in the home. And I mean, the palliative care is for any age, but it's more about providing additional comfort. It is not necessarily end of life care, but palliative care can transition into hospice care, which is more of that end of life. In palliative care, you can still be doing invasive surgeries and treatments and all of these things. And traditionally in hospice care, all of that stops. We were still giving her medications, but now we were adding morphine. We were doing everything we could to keep her as comfortable as possible. There was a social worker that came into our home and met with my son to help broach these difficult conversations about his sister dying and his feelings around that. The hospice team helped us create beautiful physical memories, a necklace with her thumbprint on it, a plaster sculpture of my children holding hands, just allowing us the space to grieve and process. They helped me make arrangements for her body and how we wanted to handle that after she had passed away, and starting some of these conversations before she had passed, so that in the throes of the immediate grief following her death, these weren't things that we had to be thinking about.
So the comfort care is equal to palliative care, or?
So comfort care, I would say is something entirely separate to me, and I'm not actually sure what the actual definition. Palliative care and hospice care are services provided. To me, comfort care is, it was the transition from trying to get her better. She was never going to be better, but trying to stop the seizures, trying to improve her breathing. It was instead of trying to improve her condition, we were accepting her condition as it was, and instead just trying to provide her comfort and ease and as much pain-free as we could. And that meant pulling some of these treatments that had been keeping her alive. So it was, we made the choice to let her go. She did not die from a seizure. She did not die of her own accord. It was because we made the choice. And I I never would have thought that I would have had to have made that choice for 2 of my children, but here we are.
How do you deal with making those decisions? I've made a decision like that for my child, taking off life support so I can relate to making that decision. But let's find out, how did you deal with that? Or how are you dealing with that, maybe present or past tense?
Well, I mean, I resisted it for a long time. And, what's interesting is that looking now, I know that in both situations, Elvis and Adelaide, I know that I made the best decision for my children. I do not question that at all. I honestly feel some guilt that perhaps I held on to Adelaide longer than I should have. Did I put her through additional pain and suffering because I wasn't ready to let her go? So I don't struggle now with have had to make that choice. I struggle with, should I have made it sooner?
Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile that question?
I have learned, and this was something that I learned when Adelaide was alive, and it's grace that I have to offer myself, is that I made the best decisions at the time with the information that I had in that moment. And as the person that I was in that moment, I now know the genetic alphabet soup of whatever her condition was that caused all of this, which is neurodegenerative, which children don't survive from. And so, but I didn't know that at the time.
Exactly.
I had no idea what was causing this. So in my mind, I was like, if we can just hold on, if, maybe the next treatment, the next drug, the next thing, and if I don't try everything that I can, if I don't reach out to every researcher, every clinician, if I don't fight as hard as I can for her, then what if I find out 2 months, 6 months, 10 years later that this treatment was out there and it could have saved her? And if we had just held on a little longer, then I would have had that. And now I know that was never going to exist. But I made the decision for her, the best decisions for her that I could in the moment. And so I remind myself of that regularly.
And still, there's no circumventing grief. So Adelaide passed away, and the grief is still part of that journey.
Always. It will always be part of it. And I don't want it to not be a part of it, right? Grief is an expression of love, and I loved her deeply. And as any child, as any parent loves their child. And so I want to hold on to the grief, but what that looks like has changed over the years. So when she first passed away, I was, I think I was still in denial. I mean, clearly she was gone. Our house was so quiet. The machines that had been beeping or pumping oxygen, the medicine, the 5 times a day medicine, like all of that stopped. There was this wild before and after what our lives had looked like and what they were the day, the morning we woke up and she wasn't gone. But I needed to keep moving forward. I was terrified, I think, that if I stopped, that I wouldn't be able to get going again. So I already had, I was accepting an award for my blog. I had a trip with some other epilepsy moms. We were going to Epilepsy Awareness Day at Disneyland as a family where I was speaking. I was still attending meetings for Cure Epilepsy and hosting their podcast. I continued with my life for about a month before I crashed and burned. Around Thanksgiving, I had this forced stop because we were celebrating American Thanksgiving, and I had to stop. Everything stopped. And I was right. I couldn't get going again. Life caught up to me, and it needed to. It absolutely needed to. That didn't make it easier. And then COVID happened in March. And that felt like some sort of really cruel joke, because from Thanksgiving through most of February, I had not been able to leave our home. I was shattered. I mean, just getting out of bed was a struggle. I would crumble on the bathroom floor. It was everything I could do just to survive and maintain some semblance of health for my son. And then the pandemic rolls around just as I was starting to feel like, okay, I can go out into the world again. And then we were all shut back in. And I did not take to that well. I started drinking excessively. I don't remember my 38th birthday, April of that year. I mean, I have blips of it. It was really hard. And then in July, we had to move. So throughout all of this that is going on, the week that my daughter was diagnosed with epilepsy when she was 7 months old, my husband booked the role of Hamilton in the hit Broadway musical. Mm-hmm. And we found out, we had been living in New Jersey at the time, and he was going to do the show for a month on Broadway, and then we were going to move to Chicago, and he was going to open the show in Chicago as Hamilton, the lead, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, in Hamilton the musical. So while all of everything with Adelaide is going on, we also have this very public facing life where my husband is the star of this musical in this city, and he's throwing out first pitches at baseball games and singing national anthems at NFL games. And we're going to, $1 billion condos for dinner parties and black tie galas. And it was this wild world that we had never been a part of before. And we're managing everything with our daughter at the same time. The week that Adelaide died, the producers from Hamilton called and said that they wanted Miguel to, the Chicago production was going to be closing in January, and they wanted Miguel to transfer to Broadway. He was going to go back to Broadway in March. So he was in New York. He had gotten 10 performances in before he came back to Chicago to be with my son and I. Our plan was that we were going to stay in Chicago through the end of the summer and then move back to be with Miguel, and have Jackson start his next school year there. But by July, we realized that there was this pandemic was not ending anytime soon. And we had 2 mortgages and no income. And maybe we needed a shift. And so we ended up selling our Chicago condo and moving back to New Jersey, where we had our home here. Not realizing that we were still going to be, essentially shut in for another year still. And it just felt like the blows kept coming. We had, our daughter's almost her entire life had been in Chicago. All the people who had been through that with us, who knew her, they were all in Chicago, and we were now leaving them to move back to a community where we did have friends. We had lived there before, but they didn't know our daughter the same way. They didn't know our journey. They didn't understand my grief, not to mention just we left as a family of 4 and returning as a family of 3. It was just real icky. That first year, I didn't, I moved through, people would say, just take it a day at a time. And I would look at them and think to myself, do they have any idea how long a day is? Do they have any idea how long 24 hours is? Mm. And so I moved in Inchstones, which was what something I had learned from the disability community during my daughter's life, was that you don't focus on the milestones of walking, of talking. You focus on the inchstones that it takes to get there. And so I started applying that to my life. I didn't need to make it through a day. That felt like a milestone for me. So I just needed to make it to breakfast. I needed to make it until my son was done with his virtual school. I needed to make it to dinner, and these were, breaking it down like that. And then I could be like, okay, I did it. Let's keep going.
I like the metaphor of the inchstone. That's good. So when did you feel, looking back now over the last 4 years, when do you think it moved into yourself seeing that yourself you were dealing with the grief and the loss, and that you were moving with it, integrating it into your life? What do you think has helped you take those next steps?
It was about a year after Adelaide passed. I signed up to attend a grief retreat for mothers who had all lost children. And I've never done like group therapy. I'd never attended a retreat before. I instantly regretted it the next morning when I got the email saying, congratulations, we can't wait to meet you. I was like, oh my God, what had I done? I should not have had that second glass of wine last night. But I decided that, you know what, I'm going to go to it. And worst case scenario, I get some really great writing material out of it. But I also discovered that what I was going through, I was not alone in that my grief was normal, that I could move forward with my grief, and finding this community of other women and we all come from different backgrounds, different areas of the country. We had lost children at different stages. Not, some of them were healthy and had had accidental deaths. Some of them were teenagers. Some of them were infants. But it didn't matter. There was that shared experience of this child loss. We were sitting outside on the patio of this house, and the women who led the grief retreat, I had all lost a child as well. One of them came out with this speaker, and she starts playing like 90s pop music, R&B, hip hop, and we're all singing along and dancing. And for the very first time, I had laughed, but in the back of my head, I had always been like, do I deserve to be feeling this way? I had questioned it. But with these women, I was like, no, I just let myself be in the moment for the first time. And with these women, I just felt like we could be normal, broken together. And it was this beautiful moment. I came home from that retreat, and it was a couple weeks later or something. I think President Biden was being inaugurated. And the night before his inauguration, he held this COVID-19 remembrance ceremony for all the lives that had been lost from COVID up to that point. And he said, to heal, we must remember. And it like flattened me, because up to that point, I had sort of thought about, if I was going to heal, I needed to move forward. I needed to let go. And for him to say, this man who has also experienced lots of grief in his life, the loss of his wife and his child in a car accident, his son to brain cancer, regardless of anyone's political affiliations, you cannot say that this man doesn't know a thing or two about grief, right? But to heal, you must remember, I was like, oh, I can hold on to Adelaide's memory. I can keep her with me and move forward and allow that grief and allow her and the experience of being her mother to shape who I am and carry me forward. I'm not trying to go back to a person that I was before. I am this new iteration of Kelly. And I can hold on and remember all of these pieces, all of these lessons, all of this love, and carry that with me and heal through that, through remembering. And that it was just the perfect timing from coming home from this retreat and accepting my grief, and instead of fighting against it, and then allowing myself to move forward to heal, but by remembering her.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because just when you were speaking, the picture came to me as, and I never had this in terms of that picture specifically. I have a lot of images that come in terms of how I present or describe grief. And today this picture came to me as if grief is like this shadow that follows you wherever you are. And it's just your companion, and it's there all the time. Sometimes it's right in front of you, depends on the light. Sometimes it's behind you. But we're trying to, according to the old beliefs, the myth, we're trying to get rid of it. We're trying to get over it and let it go. But grief is the shadow that is always with us. And it's not a shadow in terms of bad energy or anything. No, it's just part of us, and it is around us. And it is a message to say, well, how do you travel on with that? And I love that the way you described it, because really, I feel that in the past, grief theorists have gotten it wrong in letting people believe that you need to get over, let go, and forget. Whereas I believe grieving is about integrating, finding new ways of relating to that person or that thing that we've lost, and update our brain in terms of connection with that, because it's no longer physical, but it is still a relationship. Yes. And then integrating, so building a new relationship and practicing that. How do I carry this shadow with me? How do I integrate, and how do I relate to it?
Yeah. And I think what makes it more complicated is that for every person, that's going to look different.
Exactly.
There's no one way to manage that. For me, it has been my continued involvement in the Cure Epilepsy nonprofit. It has been through writing. It is through sharing stories with my son Jackson, and now we recently adopted a little girl, Anessa, and it's in sharing stories about Adelaide with Anessa and keeping her memory alive in that way and maintaining those connections that we had. I still, whenever I'm in Chicago, will meet up with the nurses who helped take care of Adelaide in our home, and just being with them helps keep those connections alive. Even if it's not a physical connection with Adelaide, I can have a physical connection with the people who also loved her. And I keep finding new ways to connect with Adelaide that as time goes on. And that is also kind of beautiful in its own way. As you know, clearly there was this drastic change in my relationship with her from when she was alive to have passed. But that relationship still manages to grow and change even after she has passed. And that has been really beautiful to learn and accept as well.
So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And also, you know, I'm assuming that your upcoming book, and maybe we can bring this to the closing as well with your book, that has, I'm assuming, has really meant a great deal of integrating the loss in your life. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book so that people can get an idea?
Yeah, so it's called Normal Broken, from that feeling at the grief retreat, and that is sort of what I hope to give to other people who read it, is that feeling of being normal broken together. So it's Normal Broken, the grief companion for when you want to heal, but when it's time to heal, but you're not sure you want to. And I love the idea of it being a companion, of it being a friend, of someone who is walking through this with you. It is not a guide. I don't have any degrees in this. I can't, also, I don't think that there is a step-by-step guide on how to move through grief. Everyone traverses it differently. However, I do find that there are commonalities that many of us experience, and that's what I try and highlight with the book. And so it is a lot of my personal stories, from grieving Adelaide, anecdotes, experiences that happened that I then write about, but pull from that what I learned and mistakes I made. And I don't know that I would do anything differently, but giving other people the chance to learn from my mistakes if they want to, or to connect or relate to them. And people probably won't relate to every chapter. And that's okay, because our grief doesn't always look the same. But I've written it so that each chapter can be taken out of order. So they are titled When You Don't Want to Get Out of Bed, When You're Facing an Anniversary or Other Meaningful Date, When You're Ready to Be Okay, so that you can go to the chapter that you're feeling today in this moment. And it might be something different that afternoon, or maybe you're in this phase and it takes you months to feel something different. Completely okay. Maybe you go from chapter 8 to chapter 4 to chapter 12. I don't care. I just hope that whatever chapter you are in your grief journey, that there is a chapter in this book that can help you feel a little less alone, and like someone is sitting in the dark with you, holding your hand and saying, yeah, me too.
So I'm looking forward to seeing the book being released. All the links are going to be in the show notes, so people interested, go and check out Kelly's book and make sure that you connect with her as well, all the other links as well. So thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing your story and Adelaide's story with us and the listeners here today. Would it be okay to finish with the rapid fire questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
So grieving and trauma means?
Not all grief is trauma, but all trauma is grief.
Well spoken. The same thing comes out of David Kessler's language. And healing means? What does it mean for you?
Healing means remembering. It means moving forward. It means honoring, but never forgetting, and always loving.
And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma?
Well, I knew it before, but I'm extraordinarily stubborn. And I had to figure it all out on my own. But I'm not sure if I learned it about myself necessarily, but I have appreciated the perspective that I have gained and the person that I have become. And that person was always in there. I have a whole new perspective on life, what is important and what I value.
Sorry, what would be one thing you wish people knew about loss and trauma?
That it never leaves you. I love the word that you use, that it integrate, like finding a way to integrate it into your life. I think that's perfect. It is that it will always be with you. And there is, for me, there is peace in that, because I don't want to let it go, because that's part of Adelaide that I have left. And I want to hold on to every part that I can. And that doesn't mean I'm depressed. It just means that I love my daughter.
And what would be one specific thing that has changed since your loss and trauma that you wouldn't want to miss?
The adoption of my daughter, Anessa. There's no world in which I think we could have adopted Anessa if Adelaide was still alive and I was managing her care in the same way. And I mean, obviously, I don't wish Adelaide had died, but Anessa has been just the most beautiful gift to our family. And she's light and sunshine, and I'm just so grateful.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly, and wishing you all the best with your upcoming book publishing.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalie. This was a beautiful conversation, and I'm grateful to have shared my story with you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep reading. I promise it will get easier.